sweltering heat of South Florida, under a sky that seemed to shimmer with tension, a quiet war raged. It was the early 1960s, and the Cold War had found a front line not in Berlin or Moscow, but in the swamps of the Everglades, the coastal waters of the Keys, and the bustling streets of Miami. America's struggle against Fidel Castro's Cuba was no abstract chess match. It was fought in the shadows, just 90 miles from Havana, and Florida was both the staging ground and the target. In Miami, whispers traveled faster than the summer breeze. Young Cuban men, refugees of Fidel Castro's revolution, disappeared from their neighborhoods, summoned by shadowy figures offering a chance to reclaim their homeland. Some were fishermen, others students, but all were burning with a desire to overthrow the man who had stolen Cuba from them. The recruiters never said much. They didn't have to. Deep in the murky waters of the Florida Everglades, these recruits trained in secret. It was a place of stillness and menace. Alligators lurked just feet away, mosquitoes swarmed like storm clouds, and the humidity pressed against their chests. Here, CIA operatives taught Brigade 2506, the name given to the paramilitary group, to fight like guerrillas. They fired rifles that cracked through the swamp air, learned to rig explosives, and waded through water thick with mud and hidden dangers. Out in the Florida Keys, the drills grew bolder. There, the brigade practiced amphibious landings. As landing craft hit the beaches, the exile commandos would practice the assault techniques taught to them by their CIA instructors. They were preparing for something big, though few knew the full picture. The CIA bought fishing boats through dummy companies, transforming them into secret transport vessels. Throughout South Florida, there was activity. Convoys of military trucks roared down the streets of sunny Miami. Supply ships moved through residential canals to local safe houses. It was obvious to most residents of South Florida that something big was in the works. In truth, they were preparing for a revolution. In April 1961, it all came to a head. The army of exiles were sent first to Central America. From there, final preparations were made for the invasion of Cuba. Brigade 2506 set out by air and sea to liberate their homeland. The CIA kept Miami buzzing with coded messages, while agents moved quietly through the city's Cuban neighborhoods, coordinating supply lines and last-minute plans. But what happened next would haunt Florida's Cuban exiles for years. As they hit the beach, exile forces hit immediate resistance. The supposed covert infiltration of the island would never occur. Instead, Brigade 2506 was met by Castro's armed forces. The 1,400 exiles found themselves pinned down by a force of 20,000 Cuban soldiers. The mission had been compromised. President Kennedy was worried that sending the support of the U.S. military could escalate the situation. The last thing the new president needed was to draw the Soviets into the conflict. The men of Brigade 2506, outnumbered and outgunned, were killed, captured, or left to die alone. Miami's streets fell silent as news filtered in, families waiting for their sons, only to learn they weren't coming back. Protests erupted on the streets of Miami. The exile community accused Kennedy of withholding critical U.S. air support, which they believed led to the defeat of the invasion. The dream of a free Cuba had turned into a bitter nightmare. But this wasn't the end. In fact, for Florida, it was only the beginning. In the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs, Miami became the headquarters for a war in the shadows. On the outskirts of the city, hidden on the grounds of the University of Miami's South Campus, the CIA built JM Wave, a sprawling, unmarked base. To outsiders, it looked like a research center. To those inside, it was the beating heart of America's new strategy: sabotage, infiltration, and psychological warfare against Castro. Agents worked in constant motion. The air crackled with tension, phones rang off the hook, radios hummed with static, and maps of Cuba covered the walls, marked with red ink, targets, names, dates. Exile groups like Alpha 66 and Commandos L became pawns in this secret war. By night, fast boats would leave the Keys, slipping past the Coast Guard to drop agents and explosives onto Cuba's shores. They returned before sunrise, the salt crusting their faces, carrying whispers of success or failure. From the airstrips of South Florida, Small planes took off under cover of night. Their missions drop propaganda leaflets, smuggle weapons, and sometimes sabotage power plants or sugar mills. The risks were high. Cuban defenses were sharp, and many never made it back. Then came October 1962. It started with grainy black and white images that revealed a horrifying truth. A U-2 reconnaissance plane snapped photos of missile installations on Cuban soil. The Soviets had planted nuclear weapons just 90 miles from Key West. Suddenly, the world's eyes turned to Florida. Homestead Air Force Base roared to life. Jets lined the runways, armed and ready to strike. Nuclear bombers patrolled the skies, waiting for the command to drop their payload over Soviet territory. At MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, B-47 Stratojet bombers roared to life on the tarmac, awaiting orders. Hidden deep in the Everglades, Nike Hercules missile silos were brought to life, their warheads aimed skyward, prepared to intercept Soviet aircraft. Florida's coastline became fortified as mobile missile defense systems were set up on public beaches. Naval Air Station Key West became the front line for the Navy's blockade, as ships encircled Cuba, scanning the waters for Soviet submarines and freighters. The tension was suffocating. School children in Miami practiced duck and cover drills as families stockpiled supplies in makeshift fallout shelters. If war erupted, Florida's proximity to Cuba made it a strategic target. At DEFCON 2, humanity stood on the edge of annihilation. For 13 days in October of 1962, the world held its breath. Crisis was averted when an agreement was made between Kennedy and Khrushchev. The Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba in an exchange for a pledge from Kennedy that the US would not attempt to invade Cuba again. Floridians gave a collective sigh of relief as the world stepped back from the precipice of annihilation. JFK's pledge to not invade the island left many in the Cuban exile community feeling disillusioned. However, Operation Mongoose continued in the shadows. This was a sprawling covert campaign aimed at destabilizing Cuba. Florida's beaches, swamps, and airfields became the launching pads for missions into the heart of Castro's regime. Boats disguised as fishing vessels slipped away from the Keys, carrying explosives and infiltrators under the cover of night. Sabotage teams trained in the Everglades planted bombs on Cuban infrastructure. The CIA concocted surreal assassination plots, poisoned cigars, contaminated wetsuits, and exploding seashells designed to kill Castro himself. The paranoia was mutual. Castro's spies infiltrated Miami, their footsteps echoing through exile neighborhoods. Federal agents increased surveillance, fearful of Cuban infiltrators plotting revenge. Trust became scarce. One of the most notorious chapters of Operation Mongoose was the CIA's attempt to recruit the mafia to assassinate Fidel Castro. When Castro came to power during the revolution, he shut down Havana's glitzy hotels and casinos that were owned and operated by the American mafia. Believing that organized crime still had the networks and resources to operate effectively in Cuba, the agency approached mobsters like Sam Giancana, Santo Trafficante Jr., and Johnny Roselli with offers of significant rewards for their help. These efforts included outlandish plots, such as poisoning Castro's food or lacing his cigars with toxins. Though none of the schemes succeeded, they remain infamous examples of the CIA's extreme and covert measures during the Cold War. From the chaos of the Bay of Pigs to the brink of apocalypse during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Florida bore witness to the Cold War's most dangerous moments. Miami became the cultural and political heart of Cuban exiles, its streets alive with dreams of returning Havana one day. The Everglades, once a training ground, remained silent witnesses to covert battles fought in its waters. Nike missile silos rusted under the sun, silent relics of nuclear terror. The war in the shadows may have ended, but its echoes still linger, woven into the fabric of Florida's history, whispered in the waves that lap its shores, and etched into the memories of those who lived it.